The clerk's voice filled the courtroom, and I rose from the chair behind the bench, smoothed my robe, and looked down at the two people who had thrown me away 31 years ago. They didn't recognize me. Why would they? The last time my mother saw my face, I was 4 years old, sitting on a cold tile floor in a Greyhound station outside Albuquerque, holding a paper cup of vending machine hot chocolate that had gone lukewarm in my hands. She told me to watch the suitcases. She'd said she was going to buy our tickets and she'd be right back, and that if I was a good girl and counted all the buses that came in, she'd bring me a candy bar. I remember counting. I got to 14 buses before a security guard noticed I was alone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, because the part where I'm a federal judge looking down at the people who abandoned me is the end of the story, and you deserve to understand how a kid from a bus terminal floor ended up there. My name is Tamsin Boucher now, though that wasn't the name I was born with. I was born Tamsin Reyes, and for the first 4 years of my life, I belonged to a man and a woman who I now know were running from a string of bad debts across 3 states. I didn't know that at 4. At 4, I just knew that my dad smelled like cigarettes and that my mom cried a lot in motel bathrooms and that we moved so often I never learned what a real bedroom felt like. The day they left me, I didn't understand it was happening. That's the thing nobody tells you about being abandoned as a child. There's no big dramatic goodbye. My mother knelt down, fixed the collar of my jacket, and told me to be brave and count the buses. Then she and my father walked out through the glass doors into the parking lot, and they got into our rust-colored station wagon, and they drove away. I waited. I was good at waiting. I waited so long that the hot chocolate stopped steaming, and then the security guard crouched down next to me and asked where my parents were, and I pointed at the doors and said, "Counting buses." He stayed with me. That's the first thing you need to know about the man who would change my entire life, though I didn't learn his real name for another 26 years. He wasn't the security guard. He was an old man in a brown corduroy coat who had been sitting 3 benches down, reading a newspaper, and when the guards started making calls and the social worker showed up and I started crying because I finally understood that the station wagon wasn't coming back. This old man got up and walked over and sat down beside me. He didn't touch me. He didn't make promises. He just opened a little paper sack and took out 2 oatmeal cookies and held one out to me. And he said, "These are no good when you eat them alone." "You'd be doing me a favor." I took the cookie. We ate them together while the adults argued about which county facility I'd go to. And when they finally came to take me, he stood up too, and he asked the social worker a lot of careful, quiet questions, and he wrote things down in a little notebook. I thought I'd never see him again. His name, I would much later learn, was Walter Halloran. And on that day in the bus station, sitting beside a sobbing 4-year-old, he made a decision that would quietly steer the next 3 decades of my life. I went into the foster system. I want to be honest about what that was like, because the comments people leave on stories like mine sometimes imagine that a kid gets abandoned and then a rich man swoops in and everything is fixed. That is not what happened. What happened is that I spent the next 8 years in 4 different foster homes, and most of them were fine, and one of them was not. And I learned to make myself small and useful and quiet, because quiet kids don't get sent back. But here's the thing I didn't know was happening. Every single year, on the anniversary of the day I was found, a check arrived at whatever agency had jurisdiction over my case. It was always anonymous. It always went into a trust, earmarked specifically for my education, my medical needs, my clothing. When a caseworker tried to trace it once, it came back routed through a law firm in Santa Fe that wouldn't disclose the client. Nobody could figure out who was paying. The social workers assumed it was a guilty relative. I didn't even know the checks existed until I was 19. The family that finally adopted me were named the Bouchers, and I'll love them until the day I die. Dennis and Marguerite Boucher were both school teachers in a small town outside Flagstaff, Arizona. They were not wealthy. They drove a 15-year-old Buick and clipped coupons and reused aluminum foil, and they gave me the first stable bedroom of my entire life, with a window that looked out onto a juniper tree and a desk where I did my homework. Marguerite taught me to read better than I could, and Dennis taught me chess, and neither of them ever once made me feel like a charity case. When I told them at 13 that I wanted to be a lawyer so that no kid would ever get left somewhere with nobody to argue for them, Dennis didn't laugh. He went out the next week and bought me a used set of legal encyclopedias from a yard sale. I worked. God, I worked. I got a scholarship to the University of Arizona, and then I clawed my way into law school at Georgetown on loans and grit and a part-time job filing documents for a firm that paid me in coffee and the privilege of being yelled at. And the whole time, I had no idea that there was money quietly waiting for me, because the trust had been structured so I wouldn't touch it until I'd proven I could stand on my own. I want to tell you about the day I met Walter again because it's the part of this story that still makes my chest tighten. I was 26. I just passed the bar. I was working as a public defender in Phoenix, which is the least glamorous and most important job I've ever had. And I got a letter at my office from a law firm in Santa Fe. The letter said a Mr. Walter Halloran had requested to meet with me regarding a matter of long-standing interest, and it gave a date and an address. I almost didn't go. I thought it was a scam, but something about the name nagged at me, and I had a Saturday free, so I drove the 7 hours up to Santa Fe, and I knocked on the door of a surprisingly modest house, and an old man in a brown corduroy coat opened it. I knew him instantly. You don't forget the face of the only adult who sat with you when the rest of the world walked away. He'd gotten older. He had a cane now. But it was him, and when he saw me, his eyes filled up and he said, "You grew up." I always wondered if you would remember the cookies. I cried in a stranger's doorway. Then I went inside and we talked for 6 hours. Walter Halloran, it turned out, had built and quietly sold 3 logistics companies over 40 years and had more money than he knew what to do with and no children of his own. His wife had died young. He'd been passing through that bus station the day my parents abandoned me, traveling to a funeral, and he'd watched the whole thing happen, watched my mother kneel down, watched her walk out, watched her drive away. He told me he'd sat there gripping his newspaper, telling himself it wasn't his business, until he saw me realize I was alone. "Something in your face," he said. "I have never been able to forget it. A child understanding that they are not worth coming back for." He couldn't adopt me. He was 68 and single, and a court would never have placed a small girl with him, and he knew it, so he did the only thing he could. He hired the best family lawyer in New Mexico to monitor my case from the shadows, to make sure I was never lost in the system, never placed somewhere dangerous without someone noticing, never deprived of what he could quietly provide. The anonymous checks, the trust, the careful, invisible hand that had nudged my file to the top of the pile more than once. He had spent 22 years being my guardian angel without ever once telling me, because he didn't want me to feel like I owed him anything. He wanted me to think I'd done it all myself. "And you did," he said, gripping my hand across his kitchen table. "I only made sure the door stayed open. You're the one who walked through it. We had 4 years together after that. 4 years of Sunday phone calls and holidays, and him sitting in the gallery, beaming the day I was sworn in as a state judge. He was the closest thing to a grandfather I ever had. And when he died, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 92, I gave the eulogy, and I could barely get the words out. I knew he had money. I did not know how much. At the reading of the will, his attorney slid a document across the table, and I saw the figure, and I had to read it 3 times before it made sense. Walter had left me his entire estate. After taxes and a few charitable bequests, it came to just over $5.5 million. I wept, not because of the money. I want you to believe that, even though I know how it sounds. I wept because the will included a letter, handwritten, that said I had no children. But for 30 years, I had you, even when you didn't know I was there. You were the best thing an old man ever stumbled into. Use this to keep the door open for the next kid sitting alone on a cold floor. I thought that was the end of it. I was 40 years old, financially secure for the first time in my life, sitting on the bench as a newly appointed federal judge, and I was finally at peace with the bus station. And then, 11 weeks after Walter's funeral, I was served with a lawsuit. The plaintiffs were my biological parents. I hadn't seen them in 36 years. I didn't even know they were alive. But there were their names on the complaint, Ricardo and Lucinda Reyes, and the suit claimed that as my natural parents, they were entitled to a share of Walter Halloran's estate, on the theory that the money had been intended as compensation for the loss of their parental relationship, and that they had been wrongfully deprived of contact with me. The complaint actually used the phrase emotional damages. My parents, the people who left me on a station floor to count buses, were suing me for emotional damages. I want to tell you how I found them, or rather, how they found me, because the comments I always read on these stories asked the same fair question: how did they even know? The answer is uglier than you'd think. When Walter's estate went through probate, it was a matter of public record. A genealogy and asset tracing outfit, the kind of vultures who scan probate filings looking for windfalls, had connected my adoptive name back to my birth name through old foster care court records, and they'd sold that connection to my biological parents for a cut of any payout. My mother and father hadn't spent 30 years searching for me out of love. They'd found out a stranger left me $5.5 million, and they'd come to collect. And here is the part that turned my grief into something colder and clearer. In discovery, my attorney's team pulled their history, and we found that in 1993, 2 years after they left me, Ricardo and Lucinda Reyes had filed a missing child report, not to find me, but as part of an insurance and assistance fraud scheme. They had reported me as having wandered off and presumably perished, collected a small life insurance payout they'd taken out on me, and used a since-debunked death presumption to clear a stack of their own debts. On paper, to certain agencies, I had been declared dead at age 6. They had cashed in on my supposed death, and now, 3 decades later, they wanted to cash in on my life. The case should never have survived a motion to dismiss, and frankly, it almost didn't. But their lawyer was clever enough to frame it as a probate dispute rather than a custody claim, and a probate dispute over a multi-million-dollar estate gets a hearing, so it went to court. Not my court. I recused myself from anything touching my own affairs, obviously. It was heard before a colleague of mine, a no-nonsense judge named Constanza Ferreira, who I respected enormously. I sat at the defendant's table on the first day in a plain gray suit, no robe, just a woman being sued by her own parents, and I watched them walk in. They were old now. My father had gone gray and stooped. My mother's face had hardened into something I didn't recognize. But I recognized the way she scanned the courtroom, appraising it, calculating it. The same look she used to get in motel parking lots when she was working out which exit to take. They sat down at the plaintiff's table, and their lawyer leaned over and whispered something, and my mother smiled. She actually smiled. And my father, looking across the courtroom at me, didn't show a flicker of recognition. To him, I was just the obstacle between his family and $5.5 million. That smile is the thing I'll never forget. not the abandonment. The smile, 36 years later, in a courtroom when she thought she was about to win. My attorney was a sharp, quiet woman named Imani Osei, and she had advised me to let the facts do the work and keep my own testimony brief. We had a witness, though, that they didn't expect. Because here is something I learned during discovery that broke and then rebuilt my heart in the same afternoon. I had a sister. Her name was Delphine. She was 29, born 7 years after my parents abandoned me, raised by the same two people in a different state. And she had found out about the lawsuit the way the rest of the world finds out about everything now. She'd seen the probate filing referenced in the local news story about Walter's foundation, recognized her own parents' names, recognized the timeline, and done the math. She had grown up hearing a story about a tragic sister who died young, a sister her parents spoke of when they spoke of her at all as a wound they'd suffered. And one afternoon, sitting in her apartment in Denver, Delphine had realized her dead sister was a federal judge being sued by their parents for money. She reached out to my attorney. She asked if she could testify, not for them, for me. The day Delphine took the stand, I learned what my childhood had cost a person I'd never met. She testified in a steady voice that occasionally cracked about growing up with parents who'd taught her that family was a transaction. She testified about the insurance fraud, which she'd uncovered as a teenager and never been able to forget. She testified that our parents had told her repeatedly that I had run off and gotten myself killed and that they were the real victims. And then Imani asked her one quiet question. In all the years you knew them, did your parents ever once try to find your sister? Delphine looked across the courtroom, past me, at them, and she said, No. The only time my mother ever mentioned looking for her was after she heard there was money. The plaintiff's table went very still. I testified after that, and I kept it brief, like Imani told me. I told the court about the bus station and the cookies and the man in the brown corduroy coat who'd spent 30 years keeping a door open for me. I told them that Walter Halloran's money had never been about my biological parents because my biological parents had not been present for a single moment of the relationship that earned it. And then I said the only thing I really came to say, looking right at the two of them. You declared me dead to collect on me once, I said. You don't get to declare yourselves my parents to collect on me again. Judge Ferreira didn't even take a recess. She dismissed the suit with prejudice, ruled the claim frivolous, and, because of the fraud we'd uncovered in discovery, referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review. My biological parents walked out of that courtroom not with $5.5 million, but with the beginning of a criminal investigation into a 30-year-old insurance fraud and an order to pay my legal costs. I'd love to tell you I felt triumphant. I mostly felt tired and, strangely, sad. Not for them, but for the version of me that had spent so many nights as a kid wondering what I'd done wrong to make my parents drive away. Sitting in that courtroom, I finally understood the truth. I'd been circling my whole life. I hadn't done anything wrong. They were simply people who saw a child as a line item. There was no secret reason. There was nothing I could have been to make them stay. The thing nobody warns you about justice is that it doesn't give you back the years. It just stops the bleeding. Here's what I did with Walter's money, since the people who watch these stories always ask, and it's a fair thing to ask. I founded the Oatmeal Cookie Project. Yes, that's really what I named it. And yes, Imani told me it sounded ridiculous. And yes, Ipani told me it sounded ridiculous. And yes, I kept the name anyway. It's a nonprofit that places trained child advocates with kids in the foster system so that no child ever again sits alone on a cold floor while the adults argue about where to send them. Every kid who comes through gets, on their first day, an old man's 2 oatmeal cookies and somebody to eat them with. We've served over 4,000 children in 6 years. Walter would have hated the attention and loved the work. Delphine and I talk every week now. She came out for Thanksgiving last year and met my husband and our daughter, and she stood in my kitchen and cried because she said she finally had the family she'd been lied to about her whole life. I have a sister. After everything, I have a sister. I never spoke to my biological parents again. The fraud investigation is ongoing as of this telling. I don't follow it closely. I made my peace in that courtroom, and I left them there. People ask me sometimes if I'd ever forgive them, if they came back genuinely sorry. I've thought about it more than I'd like to admit, and the honest answer is that I don't think forgiveness is the right frame for it. You forgive a person who wronged you and wants to make it right. My parents never wanted to make anything right. They wanted the money. Forgiveness isn't owed to people who only come back when there's something to take. But I'll tell you the thing I do believe, the thing Walter taught me without ever once saying it out loud. The people who raise you are the ones who choose you on the ordinary days, when there's nothing to gain. The school teachers who buy you legal encyclopedias from a yard sale. The old man who notices a frightened child 3 benches away and decides she's worth sitting with. Blood made me. It didn't keep me. 2 oatmeal cookies and a man in a corduroy coat did that. I still keep a paper sack of them in my chambers. Every now and then a young clerk asks why, and I tell them it's a long story and that they should pull up a chair because the cookies are no good when you eat them alone. For years I believed the bus station was the most important room I'd ever sit in. I was wrong. The most important room was the one where I finally understood why my parents drove away and why Walter sat down. Because the difference between those 2 acts is the whole secret of how a life turns out. My parents made a choice that day, and choices have a way of following you home. They saw a child as a debt to clear, and so they spent 30 years clearing debts, cutting corners, declaring a daughter dead for a small check. That choice didn't stay small. It grew quietly in the dark until it walked back into a courtroom and cost them everything, including a daughter named Delphine who finally saw them clearly. Nothing fell on them out of the sky. They simply harvested exactly what they planted. And Walter planted something else. 2 cookies, a notebook full of careful questions, an open door. And that grew, too, into me, into the Oatmeal Cookie Project, into 4,000 kids who never had to sit alone. Cause and effect doesn't care whether you're watching. It just keeps a faithful record. If you take anything from what I've told you, take this. Be the kind of person who sits down beside the frightened child even when it isn't your business, because the small decency you show when there's nothing in it for you is the truest thing about you. That's what saved my life. Not money, but a man who decided a stranger was worth his time. Decency that costs you something is the only decency that counts, and learn to see clearly. My parents lied to Delphine for decades, and the moment she did the math, the moment she looked at the dates and the missing child report and refused to accept the comfortable story she'd been handed, the whole thing came apart. Truth is patient. It waits for someone willing to actually look. Be the one who looks, who reads the file, who asks the careful questions, who isn't afraid of what the facts might say about people you'd rather believe in. Most of all, keep going. There were years I made myself small in foster homes just to avoid being sent back. Nights I was certain I'd done something unforgivable as a 4-year-old. I hadn't. I just had to outlast the lie long enough to find the truth. Nobody handed me that bench in the courtroom. I earned it, 1 filed document, 1 night shift, 1 loan payment at a time, and I'd have earned it even if Walter's money had never come. The money was a gift. The grit was mine. So sit with the lonely kid. Look hard at the comfortable lies. And when the station floor is cold and the car has already pulled away, count the buses anyway. because the person who keeps counting is the one still standing when the door finally opens. Mine opened. Yours can too. The cookies, after all, are no good when you eat them alone.